And so I think it's important to give each other and give ourselves that space, like while we're going through that process, especially being in your age, right? You're 25. To me, this is like peak. I'm starting to dig into myself to figure out who I am. This is like the meat of that time to say, I need to look in the mirror and really start to figure this out. Because maybe around the corner, possibly, is I want that family. So I want to know what I'm going to bring into that family. So I need to figure that out first.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm going to segue into my next question, talking about culture and how that shapes our perception. Because again, I believe that our environment shapes our perception, which shapes our reality. Perception is reality for the vast majority of people. How do you think any part of your culture, however you want to define culture, that can be from your ethnic background, that can be from the geographic region that you grew up in, how do you think culture has shaped your perspective in your life up until this point?
It's interesting because both my parents migrated from Colombia to Russia.
Okay.
Lived in Russia for 10 years, thereabouts, and then moved to the UK. And so I would say that my parents aren't like your traditional folkloric sort of Colombian person in terms of like they're not religious, they're not super strict about things.
Yeah.
Like mom's a doctor and my dad's like a politician / teacher / like human activist. So they're pretty open to having conversations that I want to say not, at least the Colombians that I've been around aren't as willing to have.
Okay.
So I've been very lucky in that sense.
Beautiful.
And they've always given me such liberty to explore life.
I would say there is aspects of culture in there though, and that maybe because they're non-traditional and they are well traveled, I'm sure, like you're saying, that has added to your outlook.
Yes, definitely. So because both my parents are quite well traveled, they have a level of education that's allowed them to really thrive in different communities.
Sure.
That's something that I was like able to grow up and see. Like, oh wow, like he doesn't just stick with this one group. Like he goes and she goes to all these other different communities and has interactions with them, and that's been really profound in my life because I find myself doing that now. Like we even the way we met is quite unconventional, and I think like the typical person, or like maybe like I don't want to say typical person, but some people would never just have conversations with a random person and be like, let's do a podcast together, like, you know. No. Like it's
very, very factual. Yeah,
right. Like, but I think the fact that I also grew up in London town, which is super multicultural, like it's a melting pot, it's amazing. I love London. I got to grow up with so many different type of people, like people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, speaking different languages, practicing different religions. It allowed me to be exposed to all of these things and question and investigate, and learn for myself what resonates, what doesn't.
Sure.
So that was really, really cool. Growing up as a British Colombian, it's really different to the US. Like there's quite a large Latino population in the US.
Very true.
We still have to tick like other in census boxes because we're such a small population in the UK. Like we are a growing population, but we're still really, really small.
Okay.
Even like Black African and Black Caribbean is relatively small in the UK. There's a large like brown, Asian, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi population.
Okay.
So even that was a bit weird because what do you mean other? I'm not other. Like that doesn't even make, what's other?
It's interesting you say that too. I'm sure there will be some listeners and viewers who have parents from two different ethnic backgrounds or come from two different parts of the world, myself included. But it's interesting you said other, because that kind of takes me back to when I was a kid. Not that other, multi-ethnic, multiracial children didn't exist, but it just wasn't as common or as prominently displayed, maybe. But when you talked about that box, you remind me of like when I had to do standardized tests, and there used to not be like a box where you could choose multi-ethnic, but also they didn't like it when you checked more than one box. So then you had to check other. And that used to be a thing for me, where I always check other than I would write in like multiracial, multi-ethnic. But just because I'm like, I feel like that conceptualizes better, who I am. But it's interesting that you're telling me that, especially for Americans, I think we're maybe not all as privy to how the population demographics are in the UK, that there's not as many Latinos, even though I do know that, Spain's probably the closest Latin country there as compared to America. We have not only Mexico, but Central and South America that are all pretty close by.
Yeah. Like the Latin community is quite small, but it's growing, and it tends to be a very tight-knit community. Like we have like pockets of Latin communities around London, and it's actually really beautiful, because we have like festivals now, like maybe we had like a festival called Carnaval del Pueblo, and that used to run, and then it stopped maybe like I want to say like 10 years ago now, and it only started again this year. So you can see like the Latin scene is growing. It's definitely growing. Even when I hear Latin music being played in different countries, like I was in PP Island not that long ago, and they were playing reggaeton, and I was like, oh my God, like this is my vibe. Like this is like, I can't believe I'm in Southeast Asia and they're playing reggaeton. This is so cool to me. I love it. Yeah, because we really I'm not that used to it in London so much, even though you have like your Latin hubs that are really pushing for the scene to come out, which is amazing, and we can see the advancement in it for sure.
No, absolutely. I'm glad you said that too, because you made me think of like when I was growing up, but I would say like maybe my early 20s. Like I remember Daddy Yankee was like very big coming from Puerto Rico, so like I remember that was like a important breakthrough. We're seeing more of that and hearing more of that sound. But now you got like the J Balvins and the Bad Bunnies out there, so I mean, I think it's good to see, that blending of culture. Even I would say in America, like just the fact that like K-pop has gotten fairly large. Like I'm hearing people saying like, oh yeah, I love BTS and these other bands. I'm like, I don't listen to it, but I respect the fact that like other people want to embrace that culture, because Korea is very far from South Korea is very far from us. Yet their music spans, and it's not like as Americans we don't know that our culture touches other parts of the world. So I think it's cool when we're sharing, more of that and feeling more of that, like we were talking about earlier, like feeling some of that camaraderie. Music, I think, is one of those great mediums that can help bring more of us together, and especially in appreciation, right? Like you're saying, like, hey, I'm in an Asian country and there's an reggaeton, like, oh, do they even understand the words? Maybe not. Maybe they just like the beat. But the fact is they have an appreciation, and that's part of my culture, and I like that they are willing to embrace that.
So. Something did come up for me with regards to like answering the question. One thing I did notice growing up was that Latinas were really hypersexualized. I really noticed that from really
in the UK.
Early. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but definitely like in London. Yeah, we're super hypersexualized, and I think I noticed that like 13, 14. And so at first I like kind of played into it, because I wanted to be part of that, like the cool Latinas.
Yeah.
And then I was like, what the fuck is this? Like I got to a point where I was like, I don't want to be associated with these certain attributes that you're just presuming all Latinas have. Like, even though I can dance, I love dancing, but not all Latinas can dance, and that's okay. Sure. And you shouldn't just make that assumption just because they're from somewhere. So what I ended up doing was like almost like dissociating myself with my culture for a little bit. So like I just wouldn't hang around with the Latino community. Like I just wouldn't really want to go to the events. I just didn't want to be part of that. And I didn't like the conversation of when someone asks you where you're from.
Yeah.
They would, like, I knew I was about to be treated differently. If I was to say, yeah, I'm like Indian or Bengali, I would be treated differently than if I'm to say I'm Colombian. And that's wild to me.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
That you pointed that out. And there's a lot of ways to take that particular topic. But I do know that I've heard stories especially from some women that I knew growing up, that in America, I know that black women were hypersexualized for a very long time. You know, some of it fallout from slavery, but just the idea that like the assumptions that people presume and cast onto other people, that, you know, like, all people behave this way or that they do this way. I usually say this on this show, that no people are a monolith at all. Now, there's common lived experiences that we can share, right? Like Latinos can have certain lived experiences that we may have in common, but it doesn't mean that they all manifest exactly the same, because each culture within the country can portray it a little differently. Right. Just like language, even though it's the same common, like Spanish language, it still can be, there's some variation depending on where you came from and how you learned it. So I think it's important to understand that importance, the way that may show up, right? There are going to be some unique differences. I do think it's interesting when you have the specific minority populations that sometimes, because it is more foreign, to use that specific word, that can come with being, I don't know if that's the exact word, but kind of like exotified, or to be presumed that way.
Yeah.
Because I know for some people, like Asians can be perceived that way, because it may not be as common to, like in America, to be around them. Right. And so you might put them in that box. The same way you're talking about Latinos might be looked at in the UK. But I do think at the same time, to combat that, my hope is that with more people becoming more integrated with, especially with the level of social media that we see as well, like it's not as foreign or as uncommon to hear that people have friends from other backgrounds, that people have relationships with other backgrounds, we procreate with each other from other backgrounds, that there creates more acceptance, and hopefully that particular feeling starts to die down a bit. But I do acknowledge, though, that there's still some countries that are like very, very concentrated, so are like of the majority. Okay. So it might be like there's going to be some moments where it's like, hey, this is still going to kind of happen, and it's unfortunate, but I'm hopeful that it's not going to be as big of an issue as time progresses.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, but you taught me something, because I didn't know that. I did not know that. Because yes, coming from America, it's definitely not. Latinos are actually the largest ethnic minority.
Right. So I can imagine it being different, because it's like you see a lot more Latinos, whereas in London it's like, oh my God, you're Colombian, you're Ecuadorian, you're Brazilian, like that's so exotic. Right. It's like, oh, get out of here, man. Stop it. Like, what the hell?
No, absolutely. And and I'm appreciating the conversation. This is the nuance, right? Like I usually make this expression, like some of us, when we are trying to like understand something, it's easy for us to fall into extremes. The black and white thinking. You are this or you are that. And I always say, for me, I'm like, because I learned this in school when I was learning to be a therapist, that life is gray. Life is gray, meaning it's a combination of the two. It is not everything is this or that, or everything falls neatly into one or two categories. Everything requires context. Everything requires perspective. Everything requires nuance. So then we have to be patient, right? And ask those questions and be curious. Because then we understand things better, more accurately. Not just, this is how it appeared to me, so I'm just going to put this on you and then keep moving. Just like you said a moment ago, me being sexualized because I'm Latina in the UK. But what if I'm not? What if that's not the trope that I want to play into, just because I happen to be from this ethnic background and grow up in this country? Do I have to? Is that fair to put that upon me?
It's an interesting thought, because that's literally what I did. Like, I became so dissociated. But then there's so many aspects of like what a typical Latina is or does that I also do, and so I've almost like suppressed myself from like really embracing my culture, which is crazy because my culture is awesome.
Listen, because I can make a direct parallel. We did touch on this on the first time we tried to do this, but I think this is important to echo. This is the similar sentiment to me hearing you say that to how Black people may feel when we don't have that connection to our homeland, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? Because you know, our identity can be tied to, you know, growing up where we grow up, in our case, talking about in America, but then still not feeling necessarily wanted, but then not necessarily knowing that history and that lineage that you're directly connected to, right? Because of obviously what happened in the past. So I think it's interesting when you're thinking about culture, and you're thinking about acceptance and thinking about values and judgments and assumptions, like all these important things that we're touching on, right? Is to try to like be patient and understanding with each other while we're all going through that journey, like going through that process of self-discovery. Who am I? What does that mean? How do I formulate that vision of who I am as an individual, how I want to contribute to my society, the type of family I want to build, the type of relationships I want to have? It's all very nuanced and complicated. Sometimes we need help, in many cases, to learn how to formulate what that even means, you know? And so I think it's important to give each other and give ourselves that space, like while we're going through that process, especially being in your age, right? You're 25. To me, this is like peak. I'm starting to dig into myself to figure out who I am. This is like the meat of that time to say, I need to look in the mirror and really start to figure this out. Because maybe around the corner, possibly, is I want that family. So I want to know what I'm going to bring into that family. So I need to figure that out first.
Yeah.
Right?